Welcome back to Jail Psychologist. I work with a lot of families of people with serious mental illness. A lot of these families will call the jail and say something to the effect of, "My loved one has been experiencing mental health problems for years and he keeps cycling between jails and mental hospitals. He's clearly disabled and can't care for himself. Why can't I find a long-term facility for him to stay in?" And it's not just families who, to be honest, I wouldn't expect to know how to navigate the mental health system. It's also mental health providers, medical staff, and law enforcement. Everyone sort of intrinsically knows that there should be long-term psychiatric facilities for people who are chronically disabled by their mental illness, but most people don't know where these facilities are or why we don't have them. So today I'm going to explain to you why we don't have enough long-term psychiatric treatment facilities and what we would need to do to get them. So I need to set the stage a little bit before I get into the nuts and bolts. Most mental health issues can be treated with therapy. Some patients and symptoms might require medication to supplement this therapy. However, there's a small but significant number of mental health patients for whom this is not enough. They either refuse to take crucial medications to stop them from hurting themselves or other people, or even with medication, they are unable to care for themselves. These patients are commonly referred to as being gravely disabled by their mental illness. As you can imagine, someone who is dangerous or disabled when they don't take their medication requires regular supervision. What does this look like? Well, you need a facility with 24/7 access to care and some sort of means of preventing patients from leaving the facility. We actually have this. This is basically what a community psychiatric hospital is. However, community psychiatric hospitals will only hold patients for a few days at a time. Why? Because insurance providers, including Medicaid, have limits on how many days they will pay for care in a psychiatric hospital. So what we really need is something like a psychiatric hospital, but one that doesn't have a limit on how long the patients can stay. Now, this also exists, but with some significant caveats. What I am describing is called a state psychiatric hospital. State psychiatric hospitals exist to house mental health patients who are extremely sick and, for whatever reason, are not responding to treatment in the community. So you might think, okay, great, call those families whose loved ones have been struggling for years and tell them about the state psychiatric hospitals. But here's where I give you the list of caveats about state hospitals. 1, they don't have very many beds. The United States has lost about 95% of its state psychiatric hospital beds since deinstitutionalization started in the 1950s. As you can imagine, this has created a supply and demand issue, where the demand for psychiatric beds far outstrips the supply. A 2025 study, which I will link in the description, examined the number of psychiatric beds available in the US compared to the number of people in the US who were likely to need those beds. What they found was that the US would need to at least double their state psychiatric capacity across the entire country in order to meet the needs for those beds. If you've watched previous videos on this channel, then you may have heard me complain about how the wait for a state psychiatric hospital bed can be 4 or 5 months. This is why. There are simply way too few beds for the number of people who need them. I said earlier that state psychiatric hospitals do not limit the amount of time patients can stay there. And that is true in theory, but in practice there are 2 things that influence this. First, there's a judicial safeguard. A person cannot be moved into a state hospital and locked there forever without any recourse. Every state is different in terms of their timeline for this, but state psychiatric hospitals have to update the court every so often on how patients are doing and provide justification for why the patient needs to remain in the facility. At these hearings, patients have the opportunity to present evidence to the court if they believe they no longer require the state psychiatric hospital. Second, and more interesting for our purposes, due to the high demand for and low supply of psychiatric beds, there is pressure on the administrators of state psychiatric hospitals to move people along. That is, they try to get people out of the hospital quickly because they only have so many beds and there's a long wait time for them. This means that sometimes patients are released from the state hospitals when they are not yet capable of living in the community again. I've seen this happen several times. Now, if we had more beds available, there would be no wait list, and the treatment team wouldn't feel so much pressure to move patients out of the hospital. Okay, now, remember when I said that the state psychiatric hospital exists to house mental health patients who are extremely sick? Well, those are not the only people who are housed there. State psychiatric hospitals also house people who have been found incompetent to stand trial by the courts. As we've discussed before, it is unconstitutional to try someone for a crime when they lack the competence to understand the charges against them or to aid in their defense. So, jails send inmates who have been deemed incompetent to state psychiatric hospitals for competence restoration, which is basically where they teach classes on how the legal system works so that the inmate can clear the low bar to be considered competent and then go back to the jail to resolve their case. But my point here is that people with serious mental illnesses in the community are competing for already limited psychiatric bed space with forensic referrals from the jails, which, according to a 2024 report from the Treatment Advocacy Center, now account for more than 50% of all state psychiatric beds. In my state, about 75% of state psychiatric beds are occupied by forensic patients. So to summarize, it's very hard to get into a state psychiatric hospital, even if it's obvious that it's the only place that can provide a patient with the care they need, because there is a huge national shortage of these state psychiatric beds. So, if you've made it this far, you understand the basic problem we have: insufficient supply of bed space. There are two obvious solutions to this problem. One, you could build more state psychiatric hospitals or expand the hospitals you have to accommodate more patients. Or two, you could change the insurance rules so that patients could remain in community psychiatric hospitals as long as it was medically necessary. Now, why do we not do these obvious things? Conceptually, this makes perfect sense and basically everyone wants this. The problem, like so many things in America, is that as much as people want this resource, they don't want it enough to pay for it. And it's actually not that expensive in the context of the national budget. According to a 2025 report that I will link in the description, the US could solve this problem by increasing annual spending on state psychiatric hospitals by about $14 billion. And I know that for average people, $14 billion seems like a lot of money, but the US budget operates annually in the trillions. US military spending is over $900 billion annually, and we have a military that's bigger than most of the other countries in the world combined. So this is not, in the grand scheme of things, a very expensive problem to fix. Also, you have to consider not only the investment cost of these additional beds, but also the cost savings as a result of keeping mentally ill people out of jails, emergency rooms, and off the streets. And you have to consider the savings not only in terms of money, but in terms of public sentiment and public safety. We will get into this in another video, but it's worth noting that people with serious mental illness are, on the whole, more violent than the general population, and statistically more likely to kill someone than a person without a mental illness. So now I'm going to tell you why our legislators won't address this problem. And the reason is that they are politically disincentivized from doing this. Remember, on this channel we talk about economics and incentives, and once again, these forces explain everything. So, to understand legislators, you have to understand that their primary objective, once they get into office, is to stay in office. They generally only make decisions that they think will help get them reelected, and 70% of US states have no term limits on state Senate seats. So, as long as they keep doing what they think the voters want, they can stay in their jobs until they retire or die. Now, don't voters want to see a functional mental health care system? Won't that get you votes? Well, yes and no. According to a survey by the Kaiser Family Foundation linked in the description, 90% of Americans believe that America is experiencing a mental health crisis. Okay, great. So they should support the expansion of mental health resources, right? Well, increasing the number of state psychiatric beds would require money. And where does this money come from? Taxes. And as much as people want to improve mental health care, even more than that, they don't want to pay taxes. A 2025 Gallup poll found that about 60% of Americans say their taxes are already too high. So, as we've already discussed, the gap between what services people want and their willingness to pay for those services is wide. And this is true across party lines. A broad tax increase is politically impossible, which means that in order to fund more state psychiatric beds, we're going to have to either move money from somewhere else in the budget or do a targeted tax increase that doesn't hit everyone. Unfortunately, most of the places in which our government is arguably overspending are also extremely difficult to cut politically. For instance, our military is overfunded and inefficient. Even reports from the Pentagon acknowledge this. We overpay for private prisons. Our healthcare system is extremely inefficient. But in each case, there are strong coalitions that will throw a fit if you try to cut any of this spending. I think a more viable solution would be to implement a tax on alcohol and, for those states that legalize it, cannabis products. Based on alcohol and cannabis sales figures in the US, a 5% tax on these substances would bring in enough revenue annually to double US psychiatric bed space. It also makes sense to target the tax on these substances because they're known to cause addiction and mental health problems. When you think about it like that, not taxing them is sort of like allowing the taxpayer to subsidize their business, since people developing problems due to the use of alcohol and marijuana creates a financial burden for us, not the people manufacturing or selling it. Now, if you are an economics nerd, you might realize that these taxes are regressive. That is, they have a disproportionate impact on the poorest members of society. If you wanted a targeted tax that was progressive rather than regressive, then I recommend you tax billionaires who are currently exempt from paying taxes. But I won't get back on that soapbox today. The first 5 videos on this channel are already all about that. So, this has been an explanation of why we have a psychiatric bed shortage and my suggestions for how to fix it. If someone thinks they know an alternative fix for this problem that I don't already know about, by all means contact me and let me know about it. I'm willing to put out another episode where we discuss the viability of alternative solutions. But that's all the time we have for our session today. I'll see you next week.